The setting, at least on paper, was routine. A G7 summit in Bordeaux, France, one of those carefully staged gatherings where the world's most powerful democratic leaders come together to project unity, discuss global priorities, and issue statements that are as polished as they are predictable. The official agenda was exactly what you would expect. Economic coordination, climate adaptation, artificial intelligence governance. Serious topics, certainly, but also familiar ones. And yet, from the moment the summit began, it was clear that none of those issues would define it, because there was something else in the room, something unresolved, something personal, something that had been building quietly but steadily for 18 months, the first face-to-face meeting between Donald Trump and Mark Carney. Now, to understand why that mattered, you have to step back for a second and look at what those 18 months actually represented. This wasn't a minor disagreement between allies. It wasn't even a typical trade dispute, the kind that gets resolved through negotiation and compromise. This was a sustained, escalating confrontation between two countries that, historically, have been among the closest partners in the world. And it had gone further than anyone expected. It started with tariffs. Not symbolic measures, but aggressive, targeted economic actions aimed at key Canadian industries, energy, manufacturing, cross-border trade. The kind of pressure designed not just to send a message, but to force a response. Then came something even more unusual. Donald Trump publicly called for Mark Carney to resign. Not behind closed doors, not through diplomatic channels, publicly, directly, repeatedly. That alone shifted the tone from policy disagreement to something much more personal. And Canada's response? It didn't follow the script, because Mark Carney, who, it's important to remember, built his career in central banking, not traditional politics, approached the situation differently. He didn't escalate rhetorically, he didn't engage in public back and forth, he didn't match tone for tone, he recalibrated. Canada began restricting energy exports in ways that had immediate, tangible effects on U.S. border states. It froze shipments of critical minerals, resources that American industries depend on. It closed parts of its airspace. And then, in a move that would have seemed almost unthinkable not long ago, it severed diplomatic relations with the United States entirely, ending 158 years of continuous engagement. That's not a symbolic step, that's structural. And at the same time, something else was happening, something quieter, but arguably more significant in the long term. Canada was diversifying rapidly. New trade agreements, new partnerships, new supply chains, Europe, Asia, the Indo-Pacific, a deliberate effort to reduce reliance on the United States, not as a political statement, but as an economic reality. And through all of this, Carney remained consistent, measured, controlled, analytical. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't personalize the conflict. He treated it like a system under stress, something to be managed, adjusted, stabilized. Which brings us to Bordeaux. Because Bordeaux was the first time all of this, the policy, the pressure, the strategy, the silence, was brought into the same physical space. The opening plenary session is where it happened. That's the formal moment. Each leader speaking in turn, the others listening, cameras capturing every angle. Donald Trump spoke third. And at first, everything followed the expected pattern. The language was familiar. American strength, economic resilience, energy independence, a narrative of control, of stability, of leadership. And then, near the end, there was a shift. He went off script, and he turned directly toward Carney. Now, that alone carried weight, because for 18 months, this confrontation had been conducted at a distance, through policies, statements, decisions, but not face-to-face. And suddenly, it was. Trump framed Canada as unfair, as uncooperative, as a country taking advantage of the United States. And then he used a word that changed everything: begging. He suggested that Canada was begging other nations for trade deals. Now, in diplomacy, words are never just words. They carry implications, signals, hierarchies. Begging is not neutral. It implies weakness, dependence, a lack of agency. And in that room where every leader was fully aware of Canada's recent trade successes, it didn't just sound inaccurate. It sounded like a mistake. You could feel it. The silence that followed wasn't agreement. It wasn't even tension in the usual sense. It was recognition, a shared understanding that something had just been said that didn't align with reality. And in moments like that, what happens next matters. Carney leaned forward, and for the first time in 18 months, he smiled. Not the polite, diplomatic kind, a real smile, subtle but unmistakable. The kind that signals awareness of timing, of opportunity, of exactly what to do next. And then he spoke, but not in the tone he had used for the past year and a half. This was different. It was conversational, almost informal, as if he had stepped just slightly outside the rigid structure of the summit. He acknowledged Trump's focus on Canada, lightly, calmly, without hostility, and then he paused. Now that pause is important because in communication, especially at that level, timing is everything. A pause creates anticipation. It draws attention. It signals that what comes next is deliberate. And then he delivered a single line, a suggestion, gentle, precise, that perhaps, given how things had been going, Trump should stop. And just like that, the room changed. Leaders laughed, not cautiously, not diplomatically, but genuinely. Some tried to hide it. You could see the effort, the hand raised to the face, the downward glance, the attempt to regain composure. Others didn't try at all because the moment was too exact, too perfectly timed. And then the cameras did what cameras do. They captured everything, the laughter, the reactions, the release of tension that had been building for months. And then they cut to Trump, standing still, expression fixed, not responding, not reacting, just holding the moment. And here's where it gets interesting, because Carney didn't follow up. He didn't add another line. He didn't escalate. He didn't try to extend the moment. He returned immediately to his prepared remarks: trade, policy, structure, as if nothing unusual had just happened. And that decision, that restraint, was strategic because it kept the moment from becoming confrontation. It remained observation, humor, a shift in tone, not an escalation in conflict. And that distinction is what allowed it to travel, because within minutes, the clip was online. Within hours, it was everywhere. Different languages, different platforms, different audiences. And what people responded to wasn't just the humor, it was the meaning behind it. Because for 18 months, the story had been about pressure, about one side applying force and the other responding. But in that moment, the frame shifted. Now the story was about perception, about how power is seen, about how authority can be challenged, not through escalation, but through clarity. And that matters, because economic power can be measured. Tariffs, exports, losses, those are tangible. But perception moves differently. It spreads faster. It sticks longer. And it shapes how every other action is interpreted. And after Bordeaux, perception changed. You could see it in the reactions. Commentators who had defended aggressive tactics found themselves in a different position, not because the policies had changed, but because the context had. Business leaders, already dealing with the financial impact of the conflict, now had to navigate something less predictable. Uncertainty about credibility, about stability, about direction. And internationally, there was a shift, subtle but noticeable. Countries that had been cautious, careful not to provoke, began to act with more confidence. Agreements that had stalled began moving again. Conversations became more direct, not because the balance of power had suddenly changed in a measurable way, but because the perception of that power had. And in international relations, perception is not secondary, it's foundational. Because decisions about alliances, about trade, about cooperation are influenced not just by what is, but by what is believed to be possible. And Bordeaux changed that belief, even if only slightly. And sometimes, slightly is enough, because once a shift begins, it doesn't stay contained, it expands. It influences how future actions are interpreted, it creates a new baseline. And that's what makes moments like this significant. Not the humor itself, but what the humor reveals, what it changes, what it allows. Because in that room, in that moment, something became visible that hadn't been before. A different way of understanding the dynamic, a different way of interpreting the balance between pressure and response. And once that understanding exists, it doesn't disappear. It becomes part of the story, part of the context, part of every future interaction. So when we look back at Bordeaux, it's easy to focus on the clip, the line, the laughter, the reactions. But what matters more is what came after, the shift, the recalibration, the subtle but meaningful change in how the situation was seen, not just by the public, but by the people shaping decisions behind the scenes. Because power is not just about force, it's about perception, it's about timing, it's about knowing when to act and when to say just enough. And in Bordeaux, in about 10 seconds, Mark Carney did exactly that. He didn't overpower, he didn't outshout, he reframed. And sometimes, in complex situations like this, that's more effective than anything else, because once the frame changes, everything that follows is seen differently, and that's not something you can easily undo, no matter how much power you have.